Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. First, let me apologize for not being with you today, not even in online synchrony. This is a pre-recorded message, and yes, it does feel somehow like a scene from 2001. Because here's the fun fact. Since this message was recorded 3 days ago, I've been traveling roughly 10 million kilometers across space. There's nothing special about me here. We all did by virtue of orbiting the sun at great speed. Now the question arises, of course, how come we have such a hard time identifying the movement of the Earth in space as a variety of orbital flights, which it is? The classical philosophical answer consists in invoking some transcendental function of grounding. You may remember here that Husserl famously said that the originary arc, the Earth itself, does not move. But I believe there is a more immediate, more obvious fact to be reckoned with. Orbital motion only becomes conspicuous, I suggest, as a human possibility, a possibility that makes sense to us, when it is coupled with the idea of weightlessness, or to be more precise, with some idea of what the experience of weightlessness could mean. Now, this consideration is almost entirely absent from Husserl's 1934 text, as well as from Heidegger. Heidegger's anxiety, you may remember, the one expressed in the infamous 1966 Spiegel interview, stems from the fact that the lunar orbiter pictures of the moon were taken by machines, not humans. That is, in my view, quite another issue, right? By contrast, the motive of weightlessness appears central to Levinas's account of Gagarin's first flight in space. I mean, the first manned flight in space, as it is. It is present also in Arendt's argument regarding the relevance of space exploration for the human condition, although in a more discrete form. The very experience of feeling, perceiving, thinking in microgravity offers more than mere oddities for the curious mind. It presents us, as I will try to argue, with a magnifying lens of sorts, a magnifying lens that yields insight into the real instability, the real plasticity of some of our most basic intuitions regarding spatiotemporal grounding, to use the term popularized by Husserl. By confronting these intuitions with the new possibilities displayed by the orbital experience, we familiarize ourselves, for example, with the possibility of being situated without occupying a place, or let's say any particular place in the usual sense. Now, it is beyond the scope of this message to actually show in detail how this works. Let me simply put it this way to give you the general idea. Yes, the Earth does move. It moves provided that an orbital perspective is effectively capable not so much of perceiving the movement of the Earth as such, the orbital movement of the Earth, but of durably occupying a vantage point that is at once above and below the Earth, as a result of the symmetry of space. This, of course, works together with the impression, induced by relative motion, of floating as the Earth is rolling beneath. Here I'm quoting from astronaut Don Lind, who nicely captured the field. Let me stop here and simply observe that this series of remarks I just made, in a way, provide the beginning of an answer to a pending question that I have left unaddressed so far. The question abruptly put is the following. Why on earth should philosophers of all people, have something special to contribute to the general discussion about space? Well, as far as philosophers are concerned, there is, again, an easy answer to this. It consists in biting the bullet and admitting from the outset that there is really nothing special that could possibly be added to the deluge of words about space exploration. You may remember Blanchot's complaint about Gagarin's ceaseless jabber regarding his space trip, the prospect of the space age. Blanchot wrote, a rambling that doesn't stop. So the feeling, I guess, and it's widely shared among my colleagues, is that what is needed instead is a general assessment of the fundamental underlying issues. One that brings out the human significance, or possibly, why not, the meaninglessness of what is unfolding under our eyes, under the scrutiny of so many authorized, specialized people. For example, we all suspect that this whole space affair has something to teach us about humanity's relation to its primordial homeland, the Earth, what Husserl described as the originary arc. And surely there is a lesson here that astronauts have been telling in their own clumsy, sentimental way, telling us about the rare moments of melancholic repose in the ISS cupola, overviewing the fragile blue marble, etc., etc. The overview effect, as we all know, comes with an increased awareness of belonging, of our need to connect, to reconnect, or possibly more interesting, the paradoxical feeling of being closer to home while in orbit. Now, the philosopher classically takes his or her cues from such universal human attitudes, as well as from certain recurrent themes in specialized discourses on space. And when he ambitions to develop a critique of the present moment, he may consider them as symptoms of the aspirations, of the contradictions of the age. Based upon this, he may attempt some kind of diagnosis of the human condition in the orbital age. And that's probably what is expected from the philosopher by his expected audience. The problem, in my view, the problem with this situation is that such a diagnosis of the age will generally appear as the confirmation of something that we suspected all along but could not quite formulate in the way we do now. Before we landed on the moon, before we fantasized about going back there and pushing things even further, we already knew in some obscure way that the Earth was going to be the big issue of the next millennium. Granted, we had to leave the Earth, or learn to wonder about it, in order to realize that the Earth is something from which humanity cannot escape. Not exactly in the sense that the horizon can never be reached, but more concretely perhaps because we have gradually consolidated so many ties with the planet at so many levels that it has become an integral part, an incontrovertible part of human history. So the Earth has indeed become the name of our planetary condition. I take this to be the prevalent, dominant view, philosophical elaboration of the space age. The Earth as the name of our planetary condition. As for space, I suggest it designates the possibility of re-engaging with the Earth, understood in that particular sense as a matter of concern, heightened, of course, by a new ecological consciousness. And of course, we may want to generalize this lesson even further, focusing on the sense of human belonging, if not grounding, that often infuses the skeptical and somewhat anticlimactic meditations on returning to the Earth or recovering the Earth, a trend illustrated in different ways by movies such as Ad Astra, Gravity, or Proxima. And by the way, thanks to Dr. Mitrovic for this last reference. Viewed in this perspective, the nature of the Earth appears more clearly. It's not merely a planet, an astral body in the objective sense in which astrophysics takes it. Rather, it is the space where the mediated action of man upon nature is concretely played out in conjunction with the ongoing manufacturing of forms of community. As such, it is a precarious, if massive, product of our own making. But the humans are turning nature itself into a standing reserve, threatening to destroy it, and themselves with it, or merely using it as a prop to support their continued endeavor of self-design. The Earth is indeed the primary subject, if not the direct object, of their ongoing technological project. The Earth is the true subject of all space programs, of all attempts at leaving the Earth or extending the planetary scope. This now familiar theme in Anthropocene and post-Anthropocene studies is confirmed in multiple ways by anthropological research, showing that space, the wealth of scientific knowledge, material technologies, representations, and affects surrounding that term, that space is through and through the product of human culture. This point, too, was well perceived by Arendt. She consistently emphasized the fact that if the off-Earth vantage point seems to objectify our planetary condition, effecting or enacting by technological means the cold, detached, non-geocentric and non-anthropomorphic lessons of modern science, it does so only at a price, that of multiplying human artifacts that require a constant negotiation of unstable cultural, economic, and geopolitical alliances. Yes, space is man-made. Thus, Gagarin's launching into orbit abruptly materialized the Copernican revolution that modern science had already achieved for quite some time on a theoretical level. But by doing so, what it demonstrated even more dramatically is the sheer amount of human mediations and man-made devices that is required to achieve the Copernican revolution. The astronaut shot into outer space, imprisoned in his instrument-ridden capsule, I quote, is the less likely to ever meet anything around him that is not man-made. And all the more so as, I quote again, he wishes to eliminate all anthropocentric considerations from his encounter with the non-human around him. The sad truth of the matter, Arendt continues, is that the lost contact between the world of the senses and appearances and the physical worldview has been re-established not by the pure scientist, someone like Einstein, but by the plumber, Gagarin. That is, this unlikely figure of modern virility, the astronaut, a crossbreeding between the engineer and the race car athlete. Arendt argues in the same way that what constitutes the genuine historical break is not so much the Copernican description of the universe, the search for an Archimedean point outside the Earth, a point off Earth from which to unhinge the world. No, the real revolution is the invention of the telescope by Galileo. For what the telescope brings about is something even more startling than whatever Copernic had to say about the cosmos, namely the collision between the human realm of sense perception and the speculative, decorrelated gaze. It is as if the technological extension of human perception managed to reflect the cosmic position of the Earth as seen from the non-perspectival standpoint of the universe in itself, right? As if the product of human knowledge and technology managed to harness, capture something beyond the human. This situation is entirely new, and it is far more difficult to decipher than the one inherited from Copernicus, which was so smoothly integrated by the entire transcendental tradition. The question is not whether at this point only a god can save us. In both her 1957 text on the launching of Sputnik and her 1963 text following Gagarin's first flight in orbit, the philosophical diagnosis Arendt delivers is at once more pointed and more unexpected than whatever Heidegger had to say. What Arendt perceives is a mismatch, a discrepancy between what we are now in a position to do and what we are capable of thinking. She discerns something unprecedented in the particular situation epitomized by the release of man in free space, or as Einstein would put it, a man poised in free space, something for which we had no prior inkling, no tacit foreknowledge, something that we did not see coming at all, and cannot think through in any meaningful way. Now, of course, this sheer novelty has something to do, something essential to do, with the actual experience of zero gravity. And although this is an experience that we may have by proxy, embracing Gagarin's case in imagination, it is probably never an experience that anyone can live, not even the astronaut himself. Whether it is actually performed or not, it is ultimately a thought experiment, one that does violence to thought, one that forces us, as Gaston Bachelard would say, to think against the brain. Let me quote from the prologue of Arendt's The Human Condition. It is as though our brain, she says, which constitutes the physical, material condition of our thoughts, were unable to follow what we do, so that from now on, we would indeed need artificial machines to do our thinking and speaking. Well, maybe, but again, maybe not. There lies the true challenge. Can we, humans, think against our brains, with or without the help of machines? If philosophy has something to contribute in that respect, it is not by referring us back ceaselessly to the general theme of world alienation. Those who equate the orbital condition with a state of radical off-Earth uprootedness are, in my view, missing the point entirely. Because, of course, what is at stake here is the peculiar variety of uprootedness involved in the fact of floating around freely in space. Remember Einstein, a man poised in free space. Now, If we acknowledge that the novelty of orbital experience involves thinking against our brains, then my contention is that the most distinctively new feature of that experience, the one that does genuine violence to our brain, concerns the unique temporal composition induced by the fact of living in orbit a few days, weeks, or months. Yes, it is a matter of time. My entire class this summer at AGS was devoted to unpacking certain issues pertaining to the temporal underpinnings of the orbital condition. The guiding intuition can be put simply. The question is not where off-Earth happens, or where it will lead us, but when, according to what time. Arendt, for one, was very much aware that the issue was as much temporal as it was spatial. Her 1957 text bears an immediate reference to the sheer expanse of time opening up before us in space, the possibility for humans to actively weave their historical temporality with the cosmic time that up to now was forbidden to us mortals bound by earthly time, and seemed as a result to last from eternity to eternity. The launching of Sputnik effects, you may say, a dramatic temporalization of cosmic time in the direction of human time in that respect. Somewhat further in the book, Arendt elaborates a little bit about relativity theory, the fact that in the thoroughly centerless worldview developed by Einstein, there is no way to give objective meaning to the global frame invariant now. There is indeed, as Einstein writes himself, no definite present instant where all matter is simultaneously real. The 1963 text is even more insistent on that chapter, referring to the famous twin paradox. The slowing down of time experienced by accelerated observers, the resulting difficulties in assessing the simultaneous unfolding of two parallel durations, Earth-bound and off-Earth, is central in the argument. Following Arendt's lead, rather than the general orientation of her reflection, I would like to advocate against the parochial character of earthbound philosophy, the philosophy of world alienation, the prevalent discourse of today's philosophy of the space age. I would like to advocate a more demanding and perhaps more strenuous kind of philosophy, a philosophy that seeks to achieve, in its own terms, a certain degree of precision in the identification of the novelties that provoke us to think. You may meditate upon world alienation as much as you want, this will tell you nothing about orbital time. We need a philosophy of precision. Now, in order to achieve this, we need to take into account not only relativistic temporal aberrations, I've mentioned two of them, the relativity of simultaneity and the path dependency of elapsed time for accelerated observers. We also need to include the disruptions of biological rhythms, the multiple driftings and dephasings occasioned by the mere succession of about 16 sunrises and sunsets every 24 hours when you're orbiting the Earth. So that's one thing. Another crucial factor is the constant intertwining of local time and global time. So for example, you have on board so-called mission elapsed time, which defines a local clock time, with the possibility of literally scanning through the globally partitioned time of the Earth, according to the so-called universal coordinate time system. And this accounts for an interesting layering of durations interlocking at different levels from local to global. In a different perspective, but it's really the same issue at core. It's the same formal issue. There is the polarity between the focused time of astronautic activities and in the background, the constant humming, the turmoil of world history being played out at a global stage, which is itself fractured and disjointed. And a film like Out of the Present by Andrei Ujika is, of course, entirely about that. It entirely revolves around that kind of dialectic. To which we may add, finally, more elusive aspects at both ends of the temporal spectrum. On the one hand, the minute disturbances in felt time and their impact on perceptual and fine sensorimotor coordination in microgravity. These phenomena have been studied by neuroscientists. On the other hand, you have the impact of prolonged isolation on the human psyche, the tendential slowing down of time, which sort of compensates the acceleration of time in perceived measures of perceived time. This is all very complex and still very much under study. In my 3-day seminar at EGS, I have made the case for an inquiry which would include all these aspects of orbital time along the lines defined by Gaston Bachelard in his writings on vertical or formal time. I have basically argued that in order to account for the novelty of the orbital experience in temporal terms, in order to outline the highly artificial and also precarious temporal compositions achieved in such conditions, in order to assess the wider relevance of such temporal compositions to certain transformations affecting the collective sensorium on Earth, more specifically perhaps the temporal and historical consciousness, well, we first need to keep in view all the factors just mentioned, and then try to organize them around a few dualities or polarities. So local time and global time is one of them. Another would be lived time and thought time, which I've already touched upon. And more importantly, and in order to remain true to the deep affective resonance of the whole astronautic experience of zero gravity, I suggest that we set it against the background of a more fundamental kind of dialectic, one which I believe stems from the very conditions of weightlessness. So here, the notion of the abyss as defined by Gaston Bachelard in his Psychology of Gravity, I think provides just what we need. It is best approached in terms of a core formal structure that can be spelled out in dynamic and possibly temporal terms. Very briefly, it implies the paradoxical simultaneity of falling and rising, the disjunctive synthesis of the dynamics of descent and ascent. So Bachelard has many ways of illustrating, analyzing this notion, mostly through the close reading of poetic texts. But I think this structure nicely resonates with the very experience of free fall, which, as you know, ideally supposes that one yields entirely to gravity. And I suggest that this also provides a kind of a temporal counterpart to the probably more familiar spatial figures offered by photographs of astronauts hanging below the surface of the Earth, or for that matter, photographs of the blue marble, the Earth, hanging below the surface of the Moon. The dimension at work in such figure ground reversals corresponds, I surmise, to what Bachelard identified in the more abstract moments of the life of the mind as a vertical dimension of time. A vertical dimension of time developing in depth, he says, through a layering of conjoined, stacked, but primarily discontinuous planes of duration. So multiple times or durations stacked upon each other, and a global or overall dimension of time piercing through them, developing in depth in a dimension perpendicular to the time of life. A time, if you like, beyond our brains and possibly beyond life itself. On this, I must close because it's already quite late. I wish you a most joyous and fruitful colloquium in the disrupted simultaneity of online EGS.